This is April 21st, 2005, at the home of LeRoy and Frances Wolf at 58 Damon Road, Green Hills, Ohio. My name is Margaret Lostrow, and I will be interviewing Roy Wolf at this time. Oh, I don't want to.
Yes, this is Roy Wolf. As it was mentioned, my name is LeRoy, but most of my friends through my life have shortened it and called me Roy. I was born in a little town about 4 miles from here over in Mount Healthy, Ohio, on June the 4th, 1921. That was my residence. I was born and raised in Parish in Kinney Avenue and lived there until my graduation from Mount Healthy High School in 1940. I had a probably normal life of a teenager. I had a paper route and I had a little dog named Spotty, and I played sandlight baseball in the neighborhood and just got along very well. I was very fortunate in having a family that was always complimented me. So then during my high school days, I was in a algebra class, and a nice looking young lady sat next to me, and she seemed to be very proficient in algebra, in which I was not too good. But through, I guess, feeling sorry for me, she helped me out with my different problems, and that led to a relationship, and then we were married. I don't know how much further I can go as far as my life in Mount Healthy. It was a good life. I think we did very well through the latter days of the years of the World War I. My dad was a meat cutter, and my mother was a seamstress in a tailor shop, which supplemented our income and got us through the Great Depression. Of course, those days, a nickel or a dime to us was quite a bit, so we were very frugal and watched carefully, and we really come out of it all right. I don't know what else I could add to that.
Well, then tell us why and how you joined the military and about your military career.
After my graduation from the high school, my mom and dad thought, I think possibly it's best that you go on and try to further your education, and I was attending the Southern Ohio College in College Hill, and then of course things started looking pretty dark as far as the war was concerned, and there was a place called Wright Aeronautical that opened up over here making aircraft engines, and I went over and applied and was able to get a position in the personnel department. And from then on, I worked there until February the 14th, 1942, when Frances and I were married at Trinity Lutheran Church over in Mount Healthy. We knew that possibly the war was going to interrupt our lives, so we were very happy to be able to have some time together before I went on to military service. I went into military service on 1st of October in 1943, entering over in Fort Thomas, Kentucky. And this was quite a rude awakening for me, because I had not held a sheltered life, but my home was very comfortable and was well cared for. Then about 3 or 4 days of pre-examinations and interviews, we were boarding a train and chugged and wound up in Atlantic City, New Jersey with the Air Force. And this was quite a different opening too, because we were escorted up to the Clarendon Hotel right on the beach on the boardwalk, and the directors and the sergeant says, okay, 2 of you in this room and 2 of you in that room, And lo and behold, we had a overlooking room on the boardwalk and the beach, and we had an individual shower and individual bunks. And then we were proceeded down to the cafeteria, or what was the dining room of this splendid hotel, and served on tablecloths. And I thought, if the Army is like this, I've sure found a home. So then that lasted for about 8 weeks through our basic training and interrogations. And I was sent with a group of other fellows on another train trip out to the west, and rumors were that we were going to Scottsfield, Illinois, but that went by the way when we went past Scottsfield, Illinois, and transferred on up into North and South Dakota. And we were billeted in a air base north of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Well, this was the 1st of November, and already the weather and the temperature had changed considerable from Atlantic City. So we were shown our barracks, and they weren't quite what we were looking for or expected. They had cracks there in the siding, and the snow had come in on one of their whiteouts and blown streaks across your bed. And that was a beginning of our radio operator and mechanics schooling in the Air Force to get ready for future jobs in the different organizations. Well, we completed our tour of schooling from November up until the 1st of April. And we had some severe weather all during that winter. It got to be 35 below zero. We used to have to hold on to the fella in front of us in the whiteouts in order to find our way down to what we called the Ritz-Carlton, which was the mess hall. And then we knew why they called it a mess hall. Well, then in March, or beginning the 1st of April, we graduated, and they said, well, you're going to go on for a little more education and introduction into the higher technologies of radio for the Air Force. We boarded a troop train, and we chugged, and where do you think they dropped us off? Boca Raton, Florida, at the early spring. Why couldn't it have been reversed? Well, we completed and went through our training down there for what they call IFF, identification, friend and foe. We did have a little bit of weather and also jungle training, and I said, oh boy, we're going to be going out to the Pacific, which seemed logical at the time. Well, that didn't really happen. We were sent out for a category in Salt Lake City, what now they recall them replacement depots, and I was assigned, and then we traveled on a civilian train from Salt Lake City up into Wisconsin, where we first joined a 100 bomb group, a heavy B-17 combat operation, which was getting ready for transfer overseas. We made our necessary changes to what they called clothing that you took, that in case of a gas attack, impregnated clothing. And those things were stiff and they were itchy, but they may save your life. We proceeded then from up in Wisconsin by train over to New York City to what was then Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. And we went into the orderly room, and Captain Horseberry, I never forget him, he was a wonderful fellow, a good commander. He said, Wolf, he said, I've been looking over your record. He said, you have never had a furlough or a day home since you first went into Fort Thomas. I said, no, sir, that's right. I said, they just kept me on the move, and they kept me busy. Frances then had made arrangements to come up from Boca Raton, Florida, where she came down to be with me during that stay, and came up to Camp Kilmer and was able to get a job through the, not a job, but a quarters or a house in New Jersey. And I told him about that, and he said, well, he said, actually, she's not supposed to even know you're up here. And then he said, I'll give you this much. He said, yeah, if I can trust you, you can have a 24-hour leave. But you be in this station tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock for reveille every morning. Because he said, I can't tell you when we're going to leave. And believe me, I was very religious on getting back in there for that roll call and reveille. And then again, I was able to go out, and that gave Francis and I a good opportunity to tour New York. We went in, had lunch at Jack Dempsey's restaurant. We couldn't stay there, but we went into that, well, it was the very finest hotel in New York City. And we went and dancing over the, it was the Coconut Grove Club at that time, where some of the finer Benny Goodman and some of the orchestras and they played there. We went up to see Statue of Liberty. Well, we really enjoyed the few times that we had in New York. And I told Francis, I said, now I leave here every morning, but I said, if I don't come back, I have no way of getting in touch with you, because that's going to be the day that we leave for overseas. And that's what happened. And Frances came on back then to Springdale to be with her mother and sister on Kemper Road. And I guess that's about all I have to say at this point.
What about where did you serve overseas?
Well, we left New York City on May the 27th then, 1943, and we pulled out of the harbor about 3 in the afternoon, and it wasn't a very joyous group because we just cast our eyes over on the Statue of Liberty, and as the tugs moved us up the river and out into the open ocean, and they said, we are going to experience blackouts for something you've never experienced before, because they said even a lighted cigarette out on the open deck can be seen by the German submarines that are lurking and waiting for us out there. And they said, we are not going to have any kind of escort vessels. We're not traveling in any convoy. We're strictly on our own. And this, I think the Queen Elizabeth was equipped for, say, 12 to 1,300 passengers during their days and their trips on the commercial transports. And we had 20,000 packed on that ship without life preservers, without and any kind of, and to think of the lifeboats, that was not really the thing. So that was one reason why everybody was very careful about the rules, and we would get periodic reports. And they said, now when you hear the aft guns go off, don't be too disturbed, because we have to have practice by the crews ever so often. It's demanding. It was a English crew, an English captain, and I remember the first morning we went down for breakfast, and we were served fish parts and orange marmalade on rye bread. Well, I'll get ahead of myself, but one time overseas I received a nice package from home. My mother packed some cookies, and she thought she was doing a very nice thing, and she packed in orange marmalade. So anyhow, that was the trip we made successful over. We zigzagged. We had fairly good weather. One day we did run into a terrific storm, and they said, everybody off the decks and into your cabins. Well, we only had a cabin every other night down below deck, and we had, I think it was the 1st Infantry Division, along with certain elements of nurses which took the upper decks, and some fellows from New Zealand and Australia. And that was our first experience of dealing with people from out of our own country. I was assigned to this little stateroom, and one of the fellows up above the bunk of me had just been issued a new automatic what we call machine gun. And he was putting shells in there and cranking that thing back and forth, and I thought, no way I'm going to stay in here if he lets that thing go off and those bullets ricochet around in his cabin. So I went out of there, and that was the last time I ever went back. I was able to go up and get a cardboard box from the PX, what we had on the ship. They sold crackers and cigarettes and so forth. And I found one of these air funnels, which was between the bulk of the ship and kept me from rolling off to the side. And I made a little bed of the rolled up cardboard box, and put my 2 Army blankets down, and that's where I stayed for the extension of the trip. Well, we pulled in the northern firth of Scotland, and we did have a little reception there from the English WAFs, which was similar to our Red Cross, and a little band that played Yankee Doodle Dandy and what have you. And then our first introduction to the RAF, and the boys wanted to put on a little show for us, and while we were still unloading, the Spitfires and the Hurricanes would come in and sort of dive bomb over the ship, and they loaded us on little, what we called little not cattle cars, but they only held 6 people, and the old trams of the English Railroad, and they transported us down out of Scotland, down along the North Sea coast, very beautiful countryside, being the 1st of June, and we arrived at a base in the middle of England, which was not really finished, and they said, you boys will have to watch yourself because you're going to be plodding through mud to get to your barracks. And this was at night, so it wasn't too well lit, and we stumbled and fell around and finally got in to the little, what they called Quonset huts, which were little tin huts, and they weren't very big, and they had a little one coal stove in the center, and that was our introduction to our sleeping quarters. And they said, you pick up your biscuits, and we didn't know what they were talking about, but they were 3 individual pillows, I guess you might call it, that laid on a spring mattress, and you put your blanket over those and made it tight. Otherwise, as you scooted around, you found your backside down on the spring mattress. And we were there only a short time, and they did some maintenance on the planes that had come over and flew over the northern route over from Newfoundland and then down into Scotland, Prestwick, and down into in there. And the officer again, Varian, said, well, boys, don't get too comfortable. We're going to load up and transfer down onto what we called the Wash, which was on the sea coast of the North Sea. It was just about 25 miles over from across from Holland and Belgium and northern France that had already been occupied by the Germans. So we transferred then again in the little trains and got on trucks, and they brought us back up to our permanent base, which was called Thorpe, Abbotts, Station 139. It was about 25 miles north of Norwich, which was the only large city, I guess you might call, in that area. The rest of it was all countryside and farms and beet fields, and that had been transferred from farms into a modern Air Force base, which had been taken over from the RAF. And that was quite a day of celebration when the RAF transferred all operations over to the United States Army Air Force. We brought our planes in, and we divided into 4 squadrons. I was in what they called the 350th Squadron of the 100th Bomb Group, heavy, which were B-17s, and we were getting ready to be a combat unit. We had some modifications to be made. We set up shop, and each different organization or department, like the armament department, they would bring out and load up the guns, and the bomb department would bring out the bombs and load them up, and the engineers would see that the engines were all in good shape, and I was in what we called the communications department, which was in charge of all radios and communications in the 350th Squadron for 16 planes that were assigned to us. We got our first notice of combat mission. It was in probably the latter part of June or the 1st of July, I really can't recall, but we were sent down to bomb the Saint Nazaire sub-pens on the coast of France, because the German submarines had been taking such a disastrous toll of the convoys that were bringing over supplies to all the new groups and to the army that was building up in England in anticipation of the assault on the continent. And that we were listening to the BBC, and the month that we came over in May and first part of June, the Churchill made an announcement that that had been the climax of the total shipping that had been sunk by U-boats in the North Atlantic. So I guess we felt pretty comfortable and thankful that we were able to get through and come over in one piece. We started then on our tour of operations, like I say, to Saint Nazaire. We graduated and went on in to different targets as the third wing, which was the commanding base that would send the operations to each one of the air bases on what the next day's mission was going to be. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but the missions would start out with what we called the interrogation in the morning, and if you were going to be flying that day, they had a fellow come in, and depending on what time your takeoff was, and shake you on and say, okay, up and got it, you're on flight today. And you would go to the mess hall, and you'd get your morning breakfast, which was very good at those days. Sometimes there'd be fresh eggs, and they would be potatoes and sausage and orange juice. They really fed the crews, and there was one thing we had no complaint about, was at least in my department and our bomb group. Then the interrogation would be that you would go in this big hangar, and they would pull aside a big curtain, and that the different lines would lead to your target of that day. And if it had been pretty far into Europe, you would get a bunch of sighs and oh no's and how are we going to ever make it, because at that time the Luftwaffe was at the very height of their strength, and they were going defending everything they could, because Goering, who was in charge of the German Luftwaffe, said that any time that Germany is bombed, he said, I will change my name to Schultz or Meyer. That was kind of an inside joke. But I guess he had to change his name several times, because we sure did bomb Germany. The highlights were Schweinfurt, which was a ball bearing works, because they figured if they could knock out the ball bearings and different components of the German Air Force, they couldn't manufacture their planes. Another high-class priority was the Pulaski oil fields, and that was the result of what we called a overnight mission. You would fly over the oil fields, then go over the Mediterranean and land in northern Africa, where a good friend of mine, he's called Cowboy Roan, was a pilot. He was a Texas cowboy earlier before the war, but the way he could fly a plane, I could understand why they called him Cowboy. And he thought it would be a great thing, and they brought home up back on their return mission, which then brought them back over some parts of France, and they could make 2 bomb runs in one trip. And here, when they pulled in to Thorpe Abbotts for the landing, why he told them, he said, well, we've got an extra pilot, we've got an extra passenger on board, but he wouldn't tell them what it was. And here it was a little long-eared northern African donkey, and we painted sergeant stripes on him and put on a field cap, and he roamed around just like he strutted all through the barracks area, and he was our mascot. We got through, but we had terrific losses, and we were dubbed the Bloody 100th, and that still sticks with us today. And new crews coming over would land up in Prestwick, Scotland, where they were assigned to the different openings that were available because of the losses of a combat mission that day or week. And they were told, if anything you can do, avoid being sent to the Bloody 100 because of the losses we sustained there. We got through well into the war, and then came the end. Well, we did fly in support of the D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, and we started out like 3 o'clock early in the morning, still dark, and then flew over and bombed railroad lines, bridges, anything in advance of our troops that landed in on D-Day, so that the Germans could not bring back a counterattack and slow up progress of the poor boys that went in on D-Day. If any of you have seen Saving Private Ryan, you got a pretty good idea what those fellas faced when they jumped out of those landing craft into the firing, right into the face of all the Germans' defense. We then went on to the end of the war. I won't go into a lot of more detail. And when the Germans surrendered due to Eisenhower's demands of what would they do when they...
Unconditional.
Yeah, unconditional surrender. And this was signed, and then our days of bombing missions were over, but job was not finished because they needed transportation to bring back all of the POW boys that were held in the different Stalag prison camps by the Germans, and particularly the Air Force boys that were shot down and captured either through the help of some of the civilians, people in Germany, or rather France and Belgium, that some of the fellows were lucky enough to get on what they called the escape route, which took them down through France, across the Alps in Switzerland, and then eventually made their ways back to England and to their respective units. So we then was flying to different areas in Germany or wherever, Poland, wherever there were prison camps, and returning those prison boys either to hospitals or recuperation areas, and also displaced people that were to be brought back and then sent back into their own home areas. The war was over on September the 8th, 1945. I and several other fellows in the unit, the idea of where you could be sent back to the States was done on a basis of how many points you had. And the points were based on how long you were in your service, what your experiences were, and so on and so forth. Well, my points, luckily, was way over what I needed to be sent back to the States, but they said, well, we were in need of some help down here in what we call the P-51 group, and by the way, that's something I omitted to say, that we had escorts, not in the first month or 2 or 3 months of our bombing missions, but after we were getting some new P-51 Mustang fighters that they could escort the bomb groups over and could counteract the German fighters that would come in against the group. So we had a lot of respect for the 47 of P-51s, and also during my stay, I also had been sent to 2 RAF bases and 1 class down in South Kensington, London, to attend classes on what they called the VHF, which was called the Very High Frequency Set. And this was something that saved a lot of lives, particularly when the boys would have to ditch in the North Sea or the Channel, because we had 4 channels on that, and that was another one of my it was my responsibility. Each morning we would get a different set of crystallized frequencies to put into that set so that we could reach air-sea rescue, or we could reach the head of the bomber command for that day, or whatever, or the home base for any returning bombers that were damaged and was maybe making a ditch in another country. But the P-51s then needed some modification, and that's what my job was, to go down to this P-51 group and work on them, which was altogether different to me after being on one of the big bombers, as to see the P-51s. But I know this one fella, he was quite a hotshot pilot, and he wanted to show off one of his exploits when he came back, and having shot down 1 or 2 German pilots, and he was doing what they called a flyby, and he got down so low that his propellers was cutting the wheat field, which brought in protests from the German farmers to the commanding officer. Well, I think he got a little reprimand on that, but they could do everything with those planes. They were wonderful. So then time went out there, and it was time to be shipped back with a group that was coming to the States, and we came to Southampton, England, and that was a beautiful sight to see the Queen. I came over on the Queen Elizabeth, and I was going to ship back home on the Queen Mary. Now, I've known and talked to a lot of fellows that had came back to different ports. We were due to come back in to New York from where we left. A lot of fellows came back into Boston and different other eastern ports call. And we had a lot easier coming back because we weren't so crowded, and things were a little bit more joyful and normal. I can remember sitting back on the fantail of that big ship and watching the propellers turning over and thinking, boy, we're really going back, and I learned to really appreciate the finer things. So we pulled in then to New York City, and the boats in the harbor were blowing their whistles, and the fireboats were shooting up the spouts of water, and they were waving to us out of the Empire State Building. And then I saw, too, in the Empire State Building, that happened during the war, and I understand that a B-25 or a twin-engine plane, however he done it, he landed and smacked right into the side of the Empire State Building, and there was still a big gash up in there. They were lucky that nothing happened like it did in 9/11 to the Twin Towers, but anyhow, there wasn't anything more made of that. But we had a good reception there on the docks. The band was there, and the Red Cross girls were handing out donuts and coffee, and they said, even milk, because they had heard so many complaints that for 2 or 3 years that you were overseas, at least I never saw a pure bottle of milk or a glass of milk. It was always powdered, just like the eggs were, where sometimes you would get up in the morning. England was notorious for their their fog and drizzle and just miserable weather. But you would go up and maybe you'd have to stand in line for chow, and a lot of times you had your mess kit turned up so that one of the cooks could throw in some scrambled eggs along with whatever else they had. Oh, sometimes we were very lucky and we would get a piece of lemon pie, but that would land right in the between the scrambled eggs and the pork and beans. So then the coffee was so strong that it would stand up, your spoon would stand up right in the center of it. And well, that was back in New York on our homecoming, and we would get a little square canisters of milk and a donut, and that really tasted good. Well, then we were on another train, and that chugged, and we came into what is called Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. It's right before you get onto the turnpike, and our oldest daughter now lives in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and through the 25 years or so since she's lived there, we've made numerous trips back and forth, and all the time we go over 70 and we pass Indiantown Gap, and I roll the window down and salute. And a story then, when we came back overseas, they said, now you boys have probably got some souvenirs and you got this and that, but we want to tell you, if you don't have a written document or what you might call a bill stating you received this through the channels, they're going to confiscate it, and they're going to do this and they're going to do that. Well, being in the service that long, you just didn't take everything they told you for facts. So I had my A bag and a B bag slung on my shoulder. And when we got off of the train, they said, okay, you're going to go over here and you're going to be checked out, and then they'll give you a 5-day pass to go home because we're so crowded, we can't muster you out right now. Well, I looked over there, and here they were throwing these B bags and A bags on a big square pile on a wooden platform. And I thought, that's a good place for them to go through what I had in my 2 bags. So I looked around, and sure enough, around one of the old buildings there was an opening underneath they were built up off the ground. So I just lovingly tucked my B and A bag there and went on in like nothing else had happened. And I got my check out, and the guy stamped me for a pass. And oh, what a beautiful sight when Frances came out to the gate, and she had brought our 39 Ford up to bring me back to the States. And we got as far down as to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and there were two other friends, and to meet their wives there. And we said, well, this would be a good place to make a homecoming party. So we really enjoyed that and had a good time. And then transfer started and came on back to Cincinnati. And Frances had been staying with her mother and her sister. And her sister, Jean, had a little baby boy. And her husband, Freeman Stevens from Springdale, was a father and had been out in a camp in Oregon. Well, he wanted to see his son before he left for the South Pacific. He was in a combat unit, and combat engineers. So Frances said, Jean, we'll take little Ronnie, and we'll take was it a convertible? And she said, we'll make our way out there to see Steve. That's the least we can do. And so that's another story. Probably Frances will tell about it, of her and Jean and another girl making this overland trip with this little tiny baby out to Oregon, and it was one of the highlights of the whole war as for what the home front was doing. So we came home, and then we was over here to Gene and with Francis' mom and dad, and I had been given $300 mustering out pay. So I said to Francis, I said, I just can't sit here. And I said, we ought to go back down to our old buddy Gene, Colonel Hedrick, in Boca Raton, Florida, because he never left the States. And I said, I'd like to go back down. So we got the old 39 Ford shined up, and I said, Pete, he was a navigator. He's over there in Mount Healthy. Pete Yerkes, a good longtime friend of mine. I said, I'm going to call him up, see what he's doing. I said, we called him Slick. I said, hey, Slick, this is Roy. Yeah, what are you doing? I said, well, not a lot much, but I intend to be doing something. His sister was teaching school down in Hollywood, Florida, Marion. And I said, Pete, Francis and I have decided to go back down to see the colonel down at Boca Raton. And I said, we'll be going past Hollywood. And I said, would you be interested in going down? Well, he said, I don't know. He said, when are you going to leave? I said, in about an hour. He said, I'll be ready. So that was another trip down through the Smokies, and that was something, though, that I always still kind of held in my heart about, because I had some good flying goggles that had been given to me by a pilot. They were very expensive, and I had a silver platinum case that I kept them in. They were lined with blue velvet, and I had them up in my glove compartment. And that night, a very severe storm hit down there in Knoxville, where we stayed our first night to go into Florida. So we got our separate rooms and spent a nice, comfortable night there. And the next morning, we went down, and I said, Pete, I said, I'll check out, and you go get the car and pull around. And I said, we'll load up our little suitcases and head on south. So we were going out of town about, I don't know how many miles, and I was driving, and the sun coming in from the east, there was a glare. I said, hand me my sunglasses, Pete. And he looked all through there. He said, were you sure you had them in there? I said, I certainly did. Excuse me. Well, we had not thought about it, but we didn't take them out of the glove compartment. And we had the old Zippo lighters that we had during World War II that I carried. And by the way, those I did smoke during the war over in Europe, and we were issued with at our PX with a certain amount of with coupons, and we got our cigarettes for a nickel a pack, and one carton would last us a week, unless we went on a 2-day or 3-day lead to London, which would take another 2 hours to tell you about some of those leads. But one of them I will tell you about is that we had a place in London which was called the Duncannon Restaurant, Pub, Bar, whatever. Well, over there in England, they closed their bars from 12 to 3 and then a certain time at night. Well, would you know that our train would probably get us in about noon or 1 o'clock, and we'd have no place to go. But one fellow in our unit, and we usually had 2 or 3 guys travel together, he had made acquaintance with a beautiful girl from Jamaica, and she was a head waitress and whatever at the Duncannon restaurant there in Trafalgar Square. And so we would go and we'd take a taxi from the railroad train over to the Duncannon, and we'd get there to the front door. And as people would walk past, they'd say, Yank, don't you know they're closed, mate? And we'd say, thank you, and let them go on. And we'd tap on the door and hold up our musette bags, so they knew what was in those musette bags. We had a fellow that we knew at the PX, and he'd get us extra candy bars, cigarettes, oranges, candy, and chewing gum. That was the main item. And boy, they'd open that door in a hurry and let us in. then she'd fix us a sandwich or some fries, fish and chips. They were big for fish and chips. So that was our main place to go. Well, it had been years after we were going back to England, Francis and I, because our son-in-law he's now a dean at the Lehigh University up in Pennsylvania. At the time, he was on what they call it, a sabbatical, a change of professors. He was a professor of economics, and he taught over it. So we got off there at the station from Gatwick, where we flew over into London, and got a taxi to go over to another station that would take us up to York. And we were coming out of the station and going past Buckingham Palace, and I said, now we're going down the mall, and I said, we're going to work our way into Trafalgar Square, and I said, we'll make that turn, and over on the right is the Duncannon restaurant, and then St. Martin's in the Field is next to that. He said, mate, I thought you just got off of the train. I said, I did, mate, but I said, I've been spending 2.5 years in London here, and I said, I know my way around pretty well. So I don't think he charged us any extra to take us over to the other railway station. So those are all different little items that you remember, highlights of your life and experiences in World War II. But getting back to going south then, somebody then had conveniently lifted my nice goggles and lighter and so forth. I did go back and complain, but he said, well, it's hard to say. He said, we have these transit workers and we have no proof of it, so I just had to write it off. So we did get down and had a nice stay at Boca Raton and Jean. And, well, that was another big story. Maybe Francis will want to highlight on that. So we're back home, and we're thankful that we got through and returned safely. And I guess I will, with that, thank you for this opportunity and sign off.
Okay. Can I ask you a little question? When you were in the bombers, were you with the radio equipment, or what did you do during your flight?
Well, primarily we were run over as a communications ground echelon for repair and replacement and whatever battle damage that had been done. But then when we would have new equipment put in, we would have to have it tested. Mm-hmm. And that's one point there I didn't tell about. And then we would go on what we called relief and chowhound missions. And when the Germans would flood the corridors and the flatlands there in Holland particularly, we would load up canisters of food, clothing, blankets, and so forth, and fly over at a low altitude. And the Germans said that they wouldn't fire on us and give us that much of a relief. And so I had not been actually a member of the crew, but I would at times fly in as a replacement. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but I got to know. Oh, and by the way, we do now, after the war, the 100 Bomb Group Association has reunions every 2 years. And just in '99, a friend of mine from over in Madeira and myself, we were co-hosts of the reunion here in Cincinnati. This coming October, we're going to a reunion in Pittsburgh. We have had reunions all over the United States, and we try not to miss. The last one we had was the dedication of the War Memorial in Washington, D.C. And that was really a great thing to see and be a part of.
We have another invitation waiting for us here.
Well, that's great. I'm so glad you took this time to help inform us of some of the real life during that period. I guess Francis will tell us a little bit about your life after you left the service.
It wasn't really like we were not in combat because we were right there on the coast. And when the Germans started their V2 and V1 operations, what was called the Buzz Bomb, we were right in what we called Buzz Bomb Alley. Yeah. And they would send those things over. Nobody really knew what particular target they were shooting at, but we knew they were trying to get airfields and blow up as many planes. One time they were very lucky, and they did land one in what we called our bomb dump. And boy, that was a sight. We were in what we called, we didn't have air raid shelters or any place to get in out, but we did have a mound built out behind the barracks, and we would go out and lay down on that, and that would deflect anything that was coming in, and then we would have air raids every night. Then we would have the floodlights that were surrounding the airfield, and they would fix the spotlights of a plane, a German plane coming over, and then the aircrafts would try to shoot him down.
Yeah. Okay, well, I certainly thank you, and I'm sure this is going to be great. This is a continuing story from Mr. LeRoy Wolf, a story that he would like to include on his interview. Why don't you want to...
Yes, well, I think in the instructions here for the interview, they said if you have any kind of a highlight adventure or experience that they would like to know about it. Well, a good friend of mine, Roger W. Lyons, was in our unit, in our group, in our barracks, and he received a letter. He had been a graduate of Notre Dame University and had been in a fraternity, and I don't recall the exact fraternity name, but he had received a letter, a invitation to come down to London to a special affair, a dinner that was being supported by the fraternity, and there was to be a guest speaker. Well, Rogers, it also said to bring a friend or a guest. So Roger said, would you be interested? And I said, yeah, I just got my pants pressed. So I said, well, we can go to London. Well, we got into London on the train, and we took a taxi over to, it was near the headquarters of SHAEF, of Eisenhower's headquarters in London. And I don't recall the Grosvenor Square Club, I think was the name of it. So we were, they even opened the doors of the taxi, a white-gloved, uniformed person. I said, boy, is this the right place, Roger? He said, yeah, this is what they say on the invitation. So we're guided in, and lo and behold, we get in, and the first thing they come up to us with the hors d'oeuvres, and it's sort of like a little happy hour and something to drink. And I looked around and I said, boy, Roger, I said, there sure aren't many enlisted men in this group. They were mostly all high decorated military people, some Navy and so forth. And so they came over, and it was very cordial because rank and so forth had no place. This was all just fraternity brothers. Well, we were escorted to the table to be seated for the banquet, and the gentleman came over and he asked me if I was ready to receive our dinner, which I think at that time was some kind of a wonderful steaks and special prepared by the chef. Well, then in came the honor of the evening, the speaker, and sit down right across the table from me and introduced himself to Roger and I. It was Edward R. Murrow, the top correspondent and reporter for the Blitz of London back in the earlier days. He was very nice and cordial, and later in the years when he had his own television program, I could still see him sitting across there with his checkered sport coat, and he sort of had a prop, but he smoked a cigarette on his TV program exactly the way he did that night. Thank you. Yes, sir. Good old Edwin R. Well, one other story they prompted me to mention that occasionally we would have USO shows stop, and at one time we would draw a big flatbed trailer in, and they'd lay plywood down, and they would get ready for the orchestra to come in that night, and they would have invitations out in the area to have young ladies bust in to be dance partners and so forth, and then we'd have a nice buffet. Well, that particular night, in came the band, and who marched up front and introduced himself was Major Glenn Miller. He was the leading song and dance orchestra in the ETO, and that was probably his last performance, because, as you probably know in history, that the band went over individually, and Miller decided to fly over in a small private plane, and the weather was not good, and they tried to discourage him from taking off, but he said, no, I want to get over and make arrangements so when my boys arrived. Well, that was the last that they had heard from Glenn Miller. And there's many, many stories and speculations of really what happened. So we'll have to leave that to historians.
Thank you again, Roy.